Order, order. John Penrose to move the motion.
And it's a pleasure to have you in charge of us, in charge of our proceedings this afternoon. And I beg to move that we have considered increasing choice for rail passengers, because almost no one, it seems, is terribly happy with the way our railways are performing at the moment. Not passengers who have to suffer delayed or cancelled trains when timetables melt down, as they've done repeatedly recently, causing misery for millions. Not the unions who've been in on-off dispute on a variety of routes for months. Not the staff who have to cope with angry passengers every day. Not the rail firms who've repeatedly handed back expensive franchises to the government because they can't make them work. And not rail ministers who face continuous incoming flack from urgent questions in Parliament to critical news headlines and irate passengers who lose thousands of man and woman hours battling to get to or from work every day. Which is odd, really, because until recently, Britain's railways have been quite a success story, something to be proud of. Since denationalisation, passenger rail journeys have more than doubled, and we have one of the safest railways for passengers of any major network in the EU. So, what's gone wrong? Why is everybody on all sides unhappy with where we are today? It's because, I would argue, franchising has run its course. It may have worked in the past, but not anymore, or at least not well enough anymore. It's become a brittle, inflexible, fiendishly complicated, expensive old thing which causes misery and frustration for millions and which nobody loves. And the root of the problem is that franchises put train firms first rather than passengers, because they don't give passengers any real choices when things go wrong. Why should we be at the mercy of a single train company when the timetable melts down? If a train is delayed or cancelled, we ought to be able to switch to a different firm service that's still running instead. But franchising takes away that choice. If we don't like the service which the franchise holding firm provides, tough. Our only choices are to get in a car, jams and not very green, a bus, usually slow, or just lump it and get back on the train. Which is weird, really. And we wouldn't put up with being banned from changing to a different brand of coffee or cornflakes or broadband. We expect to be able to choose between a dizzying array of different car insurers or energy firms. But trains? No. So, yeah, happily give it.
I obviously agree with my old friend that franchising has some severe problems and run its course. Would he not agree with me? One of the central problems is actually Network Rail and its inability to allocate efficiently track access and allocate the money it gets for investment and upgrading to the franchises it would do if there were more open access on the system.
Well, Mr. Moon, I would completely agree. Network Rail has all the wrong incentives, and if it had the right incentives, and I plan to lay out how we might be able to improve those in future, so it had an incentive to find more capacity and to build more capacity, then I think it would be better both for Network Rail, but also for the travelling public and for rail firms as well. But if franchising is bust, I will come on to what I think is an alternative in a second. But before I do, at the risk of perhaps annoying some of my friends in the Labour Party, I need to pause and say I don't think that, that a valid option at the moment as an alternative to franchising, I'm afraid, is renationalisation. And that's not because of the staff, it's not because of ownership models or anything like that. It's because politicians, people like us in this room, no matter whether we're from the left or the political right, we are generally useless managers of a complicated operation like a rail system. We take short-term decisions based on elections rather than proper investment cycles. We meddle in details that we know little about, and frequently we cave into vested interests of the management or staff at the expense of customers. Anyone who remembers the bad old days of British Rail will know it was a disaster. An uncomfortable, unreliable service with few passengers, starved of investment, and shockingly bad industrial relations. It's pretty hard to argue it represented some long-lost golden age of rail, which we ought to return to.
Would you agree with me that there's a lot of misunderstanding in the debate about rail? The fact is that all of the track signals and stations are nationalised and publicly provided, and the small amount of competition is just once in a while a competition to run to a timetable which is state approved and controlled and to standards which are state laid down. So we effectively have a nationalised monopoly at the moment.
Well, I completely agree with my right honourable friend. I fear that renationalisation is trying to answer the wrong question when we're already starting from a position where we as taxpayers already own the track and network in the first place. So I think it's time we stopped obsessing about failed and stale, old-fashioned options of yesterday, whether they're franchising or nationalisation, and instead try a new, better alternative that puts passengers first instead. Open access rail breaks up the franchises so passengers have a choice of different train companies on their local route. If they don't like one, they don't have to wait 10 years or more for the next franchise to be signed, because there'll be a different firm's train along in a few minutes instead.
I thank him for giving way. I wonder whether there is an opportunity to put into practice what he is talking about here with the new Oxford, Milton Keynes, Cambridge Railway, and whether that provides a much better alternative, what he's suggesting, to the existing model.
Well, Ms. Moon, I think my honourable friend is exactly right, that it is much easier to introduce open access rail where there is no established incumbent franchise operator at all. I plan to come on and develop that idea on a broader basis than just the line he mentions, but that's a very good example to get us started, if I can put it that way. Because open access rail forces train companies to raise their game. Open access services are therefore usually better too. They're far less brittle, for a start, because no single company can dictate the entire timetable. Fares tend to rise more slowly, there are fewer delays and less overcrowding. And this isn't some unproven experiment either. If you talk to local people in Hull, for example, where open access is already in place, or the Labour and Conservative MPs who represent them in that area, the verdict is cross-party and pretty unanimous. They all think it's great. So,
sympathetic. I think it's making a very good speech and congratulate him for securing the debate today. And I think he's right in saying that nationalisation is not a panacea for, or nationalisation of the franchises is not a panacea for improvement in reliability and quality. But I just wondered on the point that he's making about open access rail. He's making some good points about improving competition, which I'm not unsympathetic to, because it puts the passenger first. But what about those areas where potentially there is a non-profitable railway line? Would passengers perhaps be the losers in that situation rather than the winners, and a reduced service be the result?
Well, Ms. Moon, this is a crucial point, and the answer is that if you do any system wrong, then passengers can lose out. It's perfectly possible to organise open access rail in a way which avoids the problem which he is rightly pointing out could exist. I plan to develop that a little bit more if you'll bear with me for a second, but he's absolutely right to point out that it is a potential difficulty if it isn't designed in properly. But in principle, the reason why open access works, I think, is because it treats trains like air travel. Heathrow or Gatwick let you fly to Paris or Rome on a choice of different airlines, not just one. Why can't we do the same for our railways? Franchises would stop collapsing because we wouldn't need them anymore. Rail firms would experiment more creatively with new routes which passengers aren't getting at the moment. And if one firm was crippled by strikes, you and I could still get to work on another firm's trains instead. So what's the obstacle? What's stopping us from getting on and doing this tomorrow? Well, not much is the answer, apart from the existing franchise, which brings us to the point recently raised by my friend. Any rail firm which has paid a very large amount of money to buy itself a monopoly on a particular route is understandably going to be unhappy if someone suggests they ought to face competition from another operator as well. That wasn't what they paid for, and nor is it what their contracts say. But, Mrs. Moon, what happens when those existing franchises end, or when they don't exist at all to begin with? When they reach their contractual end dates, or when the franchise owner decides they can't make them work and hands them back, like just happened again on the East Coast Main Line? What then? Well, at that stage, at that moment, there's an opportunity. There's no one with a vested interest in protecting an existing franchise or with legal contractual franchising rights on that route. We can change the system completely. If you ask train companies about open access competition on a route where they own a franchise, understandably, they bridle. But ask them the same question on a route where there's no incumbent, and their reaction changes profoundly. So let's take the opportunity which every franchise endpoint can offer and steadily, progressively, route by route, change things for the better. We could start with the East Coast Main Line. We should auction track slots, so Network Rail suddenly has a huge incentive, as we've just been hearing, to find and build more capacity on the network, as my honourable friend was saying. Let train firms try out new services to connect places which aren't linked at the moment, or which run existing services more efficiently. Bundle some slots together for peak commuter services into cities like London or Bristol, or for less economic stations, as my honourable friend from Suffolk was saying, and expect some to need reverse auctions where we're minimising a subsidy rather than maximising income as a result. And we should stop specifying which rolling stock train firms have to use in minute detail, down sometimes to the design of the fabric on the seats. And we can replace reams of complicated legal paperwork with a few simple, easily measured, common standards of good quality train performance about safety, overcrowding and reliability that every train firm has to hit. It would turn open access from being a bit part, marginal add-on to franchising into the main event, the central, mainstream way of organising and running the entire rail network. It would be simpler. It would be less brittle. It would be more creative and flexible. It would be better value for money for passengers and taxpayers alike. More efficient in the way it uses the network and how it invests scarce resources in track or rolling stock too. But best of all, it would, at long last, put the passenger first. Mrs. Moon, I look forward to the Minister's enthusiastic response.
Joe Johnson.
Thank you, Mrs. Moon. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'd like to start by congratulating my honourable friend on securing this important debate, which, as he is aware, follows hard on the heels of a similar one yesterday. You wait months for a debate on open access, then two come along at once. But he made a terrific speech and a really powerful speech, and I'm very much looking forward to addressing some of the points he and other right honourable and honourable members have made in my remarks. I want to start, though, first by saying that I'm grateful, and the government is truly grateful, for all of the staff on the railway network who, in about 90 minutes, I'm sure many of them would want to be watching England play Croatia in the semi-finals of the World Cup, but who will be performing sterling duties, keeping the railways running and the trains moving. So I just want to register for the record how grateful I am for that. This is a debate about choice and competition, and those members of staff aren't necessarily going to have that choice later on this afternoon. Mrs. Moon, the choice to be able to travel by rail at all is one of the most important things that we can offer people, whether they travel to commute to work, to do business, or to connect with friends and loved ones. We want to offer people the choice of a wide range of journeys, wide range of services, and the railway has been steadily delivering more and more of that choice. The number of passenger journeys on offer in Great Britain has increased by over a quarter since privatisation, and as my honourable friend, the member for Ayr, Carrick and Cumnock said earlier on, passenger numbers have more than doubled. Since 2015 alone, we have opened 21 new stations on the National Rail network, including in communities such as Bradford, Midlothian and Devon. These stations offer new journey opportunities and relieve the urban congestion that slows down growth. Now, I believe, Mrs. Moon, that the opposition front bench, having just heard the remarks from the member for York, would do well to heed the concerns we've heard from the member for Keighley. I believe he's absolutely right to be concerned at the loss of choice that would undoubtedly result from the policy of wholesale nationalisation of the entire railway network advocated by the Labour Party. Our commitments to go further and to undertake further investment will meet demands for more capacity on the network. And this was a point spoken to powerfully by my right honourable friend, the member for Wokingham. He is absolutely right that to ask the important questions he did about how we can deliver more capacity more efficiently, and he made important and valuable points about the need to accelerate the rollout of digital signalling and the development of the digital railway in general, and also about the need for further investment in passing loops. I'd like to reassure him on digital signalling that we absolutely recognise the benefits he spoke of, and that the rollout of digital signalling across the UK is underway, and emblematic features of that rollout are in bits of the Thameslink programme, for example, and in Crossrail. We are also committed to giving passengers the choice of how to pay for their journey, including smart cards, contactless cards, or mobile phone. The railway also offers passengers a range of times at which to travel and flexibility over when they want to return, all provided for through a single joined-up ticketing system. So we are absolutely fully behind offering passengers choice, and our strategic vision for rail, published last November, set out our plans to offer even more choice. The Honourable Member spoke about a further type of choice in his remarks, and indeed this was the focus, and that's about choice of operator. For many journeys, passengers have a choice of operators, but it's not always practical or efficient to have multiple operators running on the same route. On many commuter routes, having a single operator is the best way to meet passengers' preferences, and this was recognised by the Competition and Markets Authority in their 2016 report on passenger rail competition. Passengers on these routes generally want a turn-up and go service where they can get on the next train. With multiple competing, non-franchised operators, this would not be possible because passengers' tickets would only be valid on one operator's services. However, and I'm coming on to remarks which I believe he will find more encouraging, however, I do agree with my honourable friend that there is a place for choice between operators in some specific cases. This is particularly so on intercity lines where travel is often much more discretionary, where people, for example, are visiting family and friends, or indeed many of the great tourist destinations that the UK has to offer, including, obviously, Weston-super-Mare, a place close to my heart. These passengers often book in advance and take a specific train, allowing them to choose a service which best suits their needs. He also mentioned the East Coast Main Line in his remarks. Yeah.
John Penrose.
Before the Minister moves on, he's being very helpful in sort of trying to cover all the different points. Can I just ask him, he was just mentioning and celebrating the existence of this integrated ticketing system that he's talking about. Doesn't that rather solve the problem that he's then saying would then crop up if you try to have people who can't turn up and go between different operators on the same line?
Minister.
To some extent, but not entirely, I think is the answer to his question. An integrated ticketing system enables people to buy a ticket for any journey anywhere in the country. It doesn't necessarily enable them to buy a ticket that is fungible across operators. The Honourable Member also mentioned the East Coast Main Line, where there are 11 passenger operators, no fewer, including the two open access operators, Hull Trains and Grand Central, who've delivered huge benefits for the communities which they serve. Or take the West Coast Main Line, where Great North Western Railway has recently been granted rights to run open access services between London and Blackpool alongside the franchised operator. This will allow passengers a choice of operators and up to 6 extra direct services to Blackpool per day on top of the franchised services already available. My honourable friend, the member for Henley, mentioned the new East Coast Railway. And it is right that we consider all options for that new railway that's now under development so that we deliver the best outcome for passengers and taxpayers. But we must deliver all types of service which a free market on its own would not do. So unless they can make a profit, franchises can get this balance right for everyone. I'm clear that open access is an important part of the railway and can play a greater role in offering greater choice in the right circumstances. Yeah, happy to give it.
John Redwood.
One day when I was trying to get back from Birmingham to London, I pre-booked on Service A to Terminus A, and their services are up the spout. And they very kindly said I could go on Service B, different company, on a different route to a different terminus, and they just honoured the ticket. So there is clearly a way of making these tickets interoperable if they wish.
Minister.
Well, my right honourable friend has made an important observation. We can certainly look at ways in which we can make tickets more fungible, but at present, the purpose of having an integrated smart ticketing system is to enable passengers to turn up and go, to use the latest technology, and so on. It hasn't as yet focused on making tickets fungible between operators, and that's something which, as the open access policy and as open access develops as a feature of our system, I'm sure will become more prevalent. As the CMA recommended, however, Mrs. Moon, a greater role for open access requires robust reforms being put in place to create a level playing field between different types of operator. At present, open access operators, as the Honourable Member knows, do not pay towards the fixed costs of the network on which they operate, nor do they contribute towards the vital social services which the franchise operators they compete with deliver. This distorts the incentives of operators and means that we cannot realise the full benefits of competition for passengers. That is why we're working closely now with the ORR on its proposals for reforming track access charges in the next rail control period from 2019 to 2024. These reforms will see open access operators pay an appropriate amount towards the fixed costs of the network where they're able to. We support this as a vital step in creating the level playing field between open access and franchised operators. We've also consulted on a possible public service obligation levy. The levy would complement track access charging reform so that open access operators would also pay towards the social services that franchises deliver to many stations that would not have the levels of service they do today if left entirely to the free market, and where government offers greater passenger choice through the franchising system to deliver social as well as economic benefits. Yeah.
John Penrose.
He's been very generous with his time. Can I just suggest to him that he can avoid quite a lot of this regulatory and bureaucratic complexity if he simply switches to slot auctioning the track slots for these things. So at that point, the right market price, the clearing market price will be discovered. He doesn't have to set all these other additional points at all.
Minister.
Thank you, Mrs. Moon. Well, I mean, I would just observe that the franchising system as it exists today is already a version of that auction he describes, in the sense
by
that
slot, by service.
In the sense that franchise
Not 10 years worth.
bidders bid a specification that they feel is optimal for that area, and the department then assesses their bids. So it is in effect an auction in some ways. With a greater contribution by open access operators towards the cost of the railways and a more level playing field, this should lead to more opportunities for open access services and thus potentially greater choice for passengers. But it's critical that we get the reforms in place first so that we can start on the right footing. And I'm going to leave my honourable friend a moment to wind up.
John Penrose.
Ms. Moon, I would like to thank everybody who's contributed to this debate today. There hasn't been complete cross-party unanimity, far from it, but I think that what we do have is a clear framing of a likely political choice. I would like to encourage the Minister. I think he's been helpful and I think he's been encouraging. I'd like to encourage him to go further and faster in this area, and at that point we will frame a very clear political choice between those who want to give passengers more choice through competition and those who want to do it in a different way, but at least then at that point, voters will know what they're voting for and what they're choosing on the day.
The question is that this House has considered increasing choice for rail passengers. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. Order, order.